if you could kindly introduce yourself, and then what I'm looking for is a bit of an insight into the old lords of the manor in Weston, the Smith Pigotts, because although they have a reputation for doing a relatively large amount of good, there was also a shadier side to the family. I would like to, or I would like you to enlighten us a little bit on that side of the family, if you would. So,
right.
as and when you're ready, John, please do take it away.
Okay, well, you want me to introduce myself, John Crockford-Hawley. I'm chairman of the Town Council's Heritage, Arts and Culture Committee, which includes the Museum and the Blakey, and also North Somerset's Heritage Champion. The Smith Pigotts are an interesting family. I tend to regard them as completely dotty, mad as a collective hatter, probably the result of inbreeding. They certainly had effect on Weston. They were a family of consequence. They weren't aristocracy, they were squirearchy. They weren't hard up for a bob or two, but they weren't mega rich. And they were caught really, I think, between a world which was disappearing, the old semi-feudal world, and the new world where trade was becoming the source of income. They were still relying on land, and that was becoming less reliable. They became lords of the manor of Brockley, Clapton in Gordano, Weston-super-Mare in the 17th century. The Smith Pigotts were the result of an illegitimate union, a union of two illegitimate children. One, an illegitimate child of the Smiths of Ashton Court, just outside Bristol, and one, the illegitimate child of the Pigotts from Brockley Court. So here were two so-called respectable families producing illegitimate children who were both cousins and who married and became the very respectable Smith Pigotts, ending up with the manor of Weston-super-Mare. Now, as time went on, they were very much used to doing their own thing, and didn't particularly appreciate the parvenus, the new people who were beginning to arrive in Weston, certainly after the Enclosure Award of 1810. People who were in trade, people who were business people, people who were becoming hoteliers. These were the people who were seeing Weston change, and they were the powerful forces for new, where the Smith Pigotts were the decaying forces for the past. So very difficult for the family. They just couldn't understand the new world. But they were utterly bonkers. They were particularly given to a love of France. Now, there's nothing wrong in having a love for France. I have one. I'm a Francophile. But I think one or two of them were rather interested in the more exotic sides of France, and certainly in revolutionary France, which was, not a particularly healthy interest at the time. Some of them weren't particularly good at looking after Weston-super-Mare. Some were. Wadham Pigott, the Reverend Wadham Pigott, who was both the curate of St John's Church and looked after the estate for his Francophile brother, who was his older brother, who was out in France. And in his will, he left £1,000 for the demolition of St John's Church, our medieval church, and the building of a new one. And the present St John's, the parish church, is the result of Wadham's bequest. And of course, he's immortalised in the name Wadham Street. And Wadham was okay, but I'm afraid after him, it rather went downhill. And the squires ended up in terrible arguments in Weston. One of them made a massive mistake, which by today's standards wouldn't be a mistake, but he became a Roman Catholic. And that was beyond the pale. I mean, there he was as the squire of Weston with his squire stall in St. John's Church, and he poped. He became a Catholic. To make matters worse, he even gave a plot of land for the building of the first Catholic church in Weston, up on the hill away from Weston. That's the present St. Joseph's. And it so annoyed me. I mean, today we would think of that and we'd shrug our shoulders. So what? But we have to put it in context. The nation was very worried about revolutionary France, about Catholicism, undoing the established order in Protestant reformed England, and so religion was seen in a political context. Bit rather like its remnants are still seen in Northern Ireland. It's that sort of unhealthy attitude, and so that all started to go wrong. Then the family, one of the squires, became involved in the occult. So you're a Catholic and an interest in the occult, and that was more than Western people could really stand, and the family was gradually being lampooned. But I think the really the bête noire of the family must have been the Reverend Mr. Smith Pigott, Reverend John Smith Pigott, who went to university as one did, graduated as one did. Didn't know what to do, as younger sons of families often didn't, and took the easiest option out and became a Church of England clergyman. That was a fairly standard thing for upper class families, where all the money went to the lead male, and the rest had to make their own way. So he enters the Church of England, becomes a priest, but doesn't have a living. Hasn't got a proper job, and ends up becoming a chum of the Reverend Mr. Prince, who was a curate at Charlinch, which is down on the Quantocks, and the two of them quickly become involved in their own particular brand of Christianity, which was slightly at odds with the Church of England. Prince is kicked out of the church because he was a curate, so he could be removed. The Church of England couldn't remove vicars or rectors at the time. And they both ended up in Weymouth, taking evangelistic meetings in the Royal Hotel in Weymouth. And they were clearly very capable at convincing people, as many leaders are, you see, particularly on social media nowadays. They were particularly good as well at convincing rather pretty young women who were not married, but who had access to funding to join their cause. And so it went on. And the more outrageous these meetings became, the more people used to turn up. A bit of entertainment. We haven't got television. People, why not go and hear some bonkers parson entertaining the crowds? Well, it all potted on without too much trouble. A few bricks through windows, all the rest of it. But the two of them then end up at another place in Somerset called Spaxton. And here, with a great deal of money, thanks to the three spinster sisters who'd come to live with them, they set up a sort of monastery, but to which both male and female adherents could spend their lives. And with the money from these women, the Nottage sisters, they built a place called the Agapemanite. To put it into English, that was a Greek word. To put it into English, the Abode of Love. And there, these young clergymen, together with some other young clergymen, and an increasing number of rather beautiful women, ran their monastic enterprise. The whole building was surrounded by walls. The services were, how can I put it politely, eccentric, to say the least. The chapel, the altar doubled up as a billiard table. The instead of having pews, there were chaise long, so you could be comfortable in your place of worship. But there was no way in which either the Reverend Mr. Prince or the Reverend Mr. Smith Pigott could be unfrocked, because once you were an Anglican clergyman, there was no law in the country that could dismiss you. And so there they were still clergymen in the Church of England. Is
that still the same now?
I'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay.
Briefly, it isn't. But they became more and more outrageous. Villagers didn't mind this, because the outrage brought lots of trippers, lots of tourists who would arrive at the village of Spaxton to see what was going on, and they were quite likely to end up in the local pub buying food and buying beer and thoroughly enjoying it. So the villagers could make a bob or two out of this this rather outrageous behaviour. Then one of the women began to, how can I put it delicately, began to look as though she had been eating too many potatoes and put on weight. And the weight got more and more, and she was eventually delivered of child. Now, nobody in this religious community was married at the time, so that caused a number of raised eyebrows. But the Reverend Mr. Prince announced that it was clearly the fault of the woman, because the men weren't party to this. So whether it was an immaculate conception or not, to use theological terms,
Jesus the second.
I'm none the wiser. But as for the second coming, Mr. Prince, they thought he was never going to die, because he had the hotline upstairs. When eventually he did die, they buried him in the grounds of the Abode of Love, in a vertical position, rather than in the traditional horizontal position, so that he would be able to ascend to heaven without, I suppose, first having to sit up and get up there. He could shoot straight up to the Almighty. They obviously believed then in the bodily resurrection, as of course many people still did. When he died, Smith Pigott took over, and he became the boss of the Agapemanites. But he became more and more outrageous. And when he announced to the world that he'd had a vision, always something to beware of with religious leaders, he'd had a vision, and the vision was that he had become the Almighty. He was indeed the second coming. So the Reverend Mr. Smith Pigott, whose family were the squires of Weston-super-Mare, had suddenly become Jesus #2, which didn't go down terribly well with the Archbishop, given that the man was an Anglican clergyman. I mean, he hadn't even become an archdeacon or a bishop. He'd suddenly gone from being simple the Reverend Mr. Smith Pigott to Jesus #2. You know, not cricket, really, is it? And the Church of England just couldn't tolerate any more of this. But how to get rid of him? So he was not breaking civil law, and he was not breaking what was then canon law, and so he couldn't be hauled before a civil court, nor could he be hauled before an ecclesiastical court. And Parliament had had enough of this. And of course, the Church of England being the state church, the established church, with its bishops in the House of Lords, Parliament decided to take action. And in 1892, passed the Clergy Disciplinary Act. And from that moment on, any Anglican clergyman, whether a rector or a vicar, or a lowly priest without a living, or even an archbishop, could be hauled before a church court, charged with conduct unbecoming, that was the legal phrase, and could be unfrocked. And the first unfrocking was indeed of the Reverend Mr. Pigott, who was summoned to Wells Cathedral, where in front of the Lord Bishop of the diocese and the Chancellor sat there in his black gown and wig. He was summarily dismissed from his position in the Church of England, except Smith Pigott didn't bother turning up. But the court decision was a decision in law, and so from that moment on, Smith Pigott was no longer an Anglican clergyman. What could not happen, though, the name the Reverend is a verb, it is not a noun. And anybody, and they still can, anybody can call themselves the Reverend. That is not a statutory offence, but he could no longer call himself a clergyman in the Church of England. And Weston-super-Mare's family, the Smith Pigotts, are therefore responsible for ensuring that the Church of England from that moment on was able to dismiss clergymen for conduct unbecoming.